Howdy, folks. Mr. McGlashan here with part two of Boom and Bust, Politics and Economics of the 1920s. So, last we heard, Hoover was president, and we had learned about how, in order to satisfy farmers, Hoover had promised a tariff. The Smoot-Hawley tariff was passed in 1929, precipitating a disastrous fall on the stock market. Here's a classic cartoon of Hoover. Trust me, prosperity is just around the corner based on that quotation that I showed you. So we have the day the first market crashes is Thursday, and then there was a slight rally on Friday. But then it just kept going down and down and down. So let's begin with characterizing the Depression itself. Yeah, we had three crashes, really. We had Black Thursday, and then, like I said, Friday recovery, Monday was up and down, and then Monday was the worst day of all, but they still call it Black Tuesday, October 29th. If you put those together, that is a disastrous fall, but it kept falling for two more years. By 1932, it was down to 11% of what it was. Unemployment in the Depression got up to 25%. In the Great Recession of 2009, the worst it got was about 10%, so that shows. And then it stayed above 15% for 10 years. And that's the brutal part, is how long it took to bounce back from this one. We've had other crashes throughout our history, but why did it take so long to bounce back from this one? Well, that's part of our question. 9,000 banks failing, disappearing altogether, bringing with them millions of bank accounts of Americans. And also, thousands of businesses, 100,000 businesses failed. So it's disastrous. So the question, of course, as you all know, is why? Check out unemployment. You can see this. It's just, we've had, like I said, there was a terrible one in the 1890s with some unemployment. We've had spikes here in the 70s, but look at the Great Depression. All right, so that's people without work. Ladies and gentlemen, your GDP prompt. There it is. I warned you. Here it is. The Great Depression was clearly triggered by the great stock market crash of October 1929, but what were the root causes of that stock crash? And what are the reasons that it precipitated such a long, deep, and catastrophic depression? So there's your question, folks. You'll be getting documents, and you'll be given a few days to answer it. So here's our master list. I'll leave that there for a sec. You should probably go back to this and pause, or when I put the PowerPoint on, I'm not going to leave it here long enough for you to write it all down, but we have a long list of causes. And basically, I'm going to get through as many as I can right now, and then we're going to come back with part three to get through to the end. So here we go. Stock market bubble fueled by speculation and borrowing. All right, so every panic or recession starts with a bubble popping. It was just straight up stocks in this one. There were a few real estate bubbles here and there, but the real crime was buying on margin is the word they used then, which is just when you borrow money to buy stocks. So as the market had been climbing and climbing and climbing and climbing and climbing in the 20s, everybody just couldn't believe it was going to keep climbing, and they could not be on that train. So whatever you could do, you borrowed, you begged, you stole, and you leveraged, which means you borrowed. And so people could walk into the bank and put 10% down. The bank would find the money somewhere to give you 90% of it, so that you'd go in. That's called buying on margin. Today, the law is you can not borrow more than 50% to buy stocks. And generally speaking, when we talk about the boom and bubble, or the bubble and the burst in the stock market, we are talking about bankers being criminals. We're talking about unregulated trading. We're talking about dirty tricks. We're talking about taking on risk that you can never handle and then passing on the fall to somebody else. So these are things that we, through long trial, throughout panic after panic after panic on our history, should have learned. Should be against the law. But the Great Depression shows us exactly what. So most of our best banking legislation comes after the Great Depression, and then we've been working on it ever since. So pretty simple stuff. Here is debt. Government and private, but if you look at private debt, it is just spiking into, actually all the way up until about 1933, when everybody's mass defaults on debt caused debt to come screaming down. But really, it's this escalating debt that is mostly banks taking on bigger and bigger and bigger debts, because Why would you keep any money around when the stock market is growing as quickly as it is? So you put everything you have into that market, and then guess what? Pop. All right, folks, a lack of banking regulation. So here we go. So we've got the stock market itself, but the deeper reason there is that banks were not following just basic regulations. Over leveraging, bank panics, bank failures, loss of people's regular deposits. So let's talk about one of the simplest banking regulations that they did not have in place, and that is separating commercial banking from investment banking. Okay, so every bank, they do two different things. When you put your money into a savings account, you do not figure that that money is being put on high-risk stocks or derivatives or whatever risky scheme that the bankers are up to. You assume that when you put your money in the bank and they say they'll pay you an interest rate of 2% on your money, that it's just sitting there and you can get it anytime. And this is not an investment. This is not a risk. So commercial banking holds our savings accounts. Investment banking plays games on markets with whoever's money. So if rich people want to gamble their money on the stock market and play all sorts of tricks on futures and derivatives, then go for it. But that should not be putting our life savings on the line. So investment banking and commercial banking need to be split, separate regulations for each. Commercial banks they can take on very much less risk because they're holding people's life savings. This is a simple rule that we don't seem to be able to get it into our thick skulls that is necessary. Okay, so commercial banking versus investment banking. The problem was fixed with the Glass-Steagall Act in 1933. This is where we really came up with the idea of separating them and writing separate regulations for the two. But guess what? In their brilliance in the 90s, everybody fights over whose fault this was. It was a Republican Congress along with Bill Clinton together, and they messed with the banking regulations. What do you know? The very regulations that had prevented bank failures over 60 years, they started to chip away at. And what do you know? We had the 2008 bank-related recession. After the 2008 recession, they started calling the same separation between commercial and investment banking. They started calling it the Volcker Rule. Paul Volcker was a head of the Treasury or the head of the Federal Reserve, something like that. And Dodd-Frank were senators that put together a regulatory bill after the 2009 recession. And they called it the Wall Street Reform Act of 2010. Elizabeth Warren was a big author of that. That's where we got the Consumer Protection Bureau, and it brought back what the Volcker Rule is, basically what Glass-Steagall was. We have it mostly, I'll tell you. It's not all the way there. So we have work to do. So back to our bank failures. As you can see, we have in 1929, get that thing out of there. Go away. It starts spiking. This is 28, 29, 30, 32, 33 right here. And so and God, can't see it, but there we go. So after that, you see we have almost no bank failures down there. Almost no bank failures. There you go. And this was a savings and loan crisis in the 1980s where we lost control of it, and government turned their back, and privateers did what they do. And this is the bank failures of 2008 and 2009, which there were not many of, because we have enacted some common sense bank regulation. All right, so regulating the banks. All right, go back and read Frenzied Finance, that book that we presented on in class. All right, moving on. This is probably also bank-related, one of the more difficult ones to get your mind around. So listen up. We're talking about banking. This is another bank story, but the Federal Reserve was enacted in 1914, and that was supposed to take care of these problems of bank panics. The Federal Reserve was in fact authorized precisely to avoid banking meltdowns. Basically, the Federal Reserve messed up. It was new. They had the powers, but they didn't know how to use them. And they take full credit for that. If you talk to anyone who's run the Fed ever since, they say, oh, yeah, we did that. Oops. They really did screw up. So let's tell that story. Interest rates, ladies and gentlemen, interest rates. Money enters the universe by being loaned into existence. Let's remember that. We don't print money into existence. Printing money is almost incidental to the creation of money. Money is created when the Federal Reserve says, pow, there's money, and it exists. And they create it out of thin air. And then they loan it into existence. They loan it to banks. So that's how money is created. is banks borrow it from the Federal Reserve, and they owe it back. All money is owed back to the Federal Reserve. Now, I bring that up because it is important to understand interest rates. When a bank gives you a loan to buy a car, for example, they will give you an interest rate, as you know. And the higher interest rate means you're less likely to borrow that money, because a high interest rate is going to mean you're going to have to pay back more money over time. If it's a low interest rate, you say, great deal, and you buy a car. If the interest rate is 20%, nobody buys cars, and it shuts down the entire auto market, except for the very few who can buy with cash. So interest rates are very important. The Federal Reserve is supposed to control interest rates. One of the main tools that the government has been given to the Federal Reserve, and that is control over the baseline interest rate. So the rate at which they loan money to banks. So basically, if they want to make money easy to borrow for everyone, and that's a way of stimulating the economy, the Federal Reserve will set the banking rate low. If the Federal Reserve If the Federal Reserve wants to tighten the money supply a little bit and maybe cool down the economy, what they do is they set their interest rate high. Because basically, if they're lending money to banks at 0% interest, which is what they're doing today, because we have maximum stimulus on right now because of the coronavirus crash. What we're talking about is the interest rate. So if they want to make it a little harder for people to borrow money, what they'll do is they'll set the interest rate up at high. They can set it at 6%. And then if Bank of America wants to borrow money from the Federal Reserve, they're less likely to, because they have to pay high interest rates. But if they lower the interest rates, then it makes it really easy for people to borrow money. Okay, in the 1920s, the interest rates were fairly low. The only part of this graph that you really need to look at is this right here, and that is, stinkers. What happened there? All right, it is right here. We have a period in the 1920s of fairly low interest rates. 4% by today's standards is not that low, but that's actually pretty low, and it made credit available like never before. And it is these low interest rates that allowed Americans to buy appliances and automobiles on credit like they never had before. So American households were over-leveraged. Sure, they owed too much. And then banks were borrowing at that low interest rate. What were they doing with the money they borrowed? Putting it in the stock market. Everyone's putting everything in the stock market. So easy borrowing allowed that bubble to build. So much of the rising stock market was based on the easy availability of credit. Basically, the bottom line is, in 1928, the Federal Reserve went, we have a bubble in the stock market. We got to do our job. And they weren't wrong. They knew that they needed to cool things down. They saw a speculative bubble in the stock market. And so what they do, they right here, raised the interest rate. And then a couple months later, raised it again. And then a little bit later, they raised it again. And it was on that final raise that it really sent a cascading problem to the Federal Reserve. Sorry, not to the Federal Reserve, cascading problem to all banks and households who had borrowed. The thing about borrowing is that if you owe a ton of money and your money is due, your loan is due, and you got to pay it off, well, you can just borrow more money and then pay off the loan that you owed, and now you have a new, bigger debt. But that gives you some time. And as long as you can keep borrowing, you can keep doing that. You can keep pushing a loan off. Well, basically everyone was doing that throughout the 1920s. They were pushing their loans and reborrowing and building up credit. Pop, we have a credit bubble. The Federal Reserve should have basically raised interest rates a little bit more slowly, a little earlier. In 1925, they could have risen them by 0.25%, and then another 0.25%. And they also could have regulated the stock market, because that was the bigger part of the problem. But regardless, they discovered in the Great Depression that the interest rate is indeed a very powerful tool, but you have to be very careful with it. And they were not. Today, we know, and so what happens in a recession is we lower interest rates, and we lower interest rates, and we lower them, which is what you'd want to do, but the problem is we never raise them again. So during good times, you should tighten those interest rates up. It prevents inflation, and it contributes to more sustainable growth if you bring those interest rates. It rewards savings when interest rates are high. But we don't do that, because presidents don't tend to like to put the brakes on the economy ever, even when it's been cranking for years and years and years. So basically, interest rates are at zero, which means the Federal Reserve has entirely used up all of its power to stimulate the economy right now. And so this as a tool, there's not much left there. So moving on from interest rates, I think actually I might just say that we're going to stop there. Let's finish with this chart here, but we've got rising debt. So as you can see, debt is up, and then it spikes, in the early 30s, and then everyone defaults. Basically, everyone, banks, households, throw their arms in the air, and all their debt disappears in mass default and bankruptcy. But notice our debt load today. Yeah, it's bad. It's bad. All right. The next one.